Thank you so much for doing this, Shideh. For everybody watching, we are re-recording our Shideh's webinar today on grief because we did not get an English recording. So just as a reminder, the humanitarian webinars, our hope is to make them accessible to as many people as possible. So Shideh, thank you so much for doing this at this time in history, as so many people are holding so much grief and really not sure how to navigate it or what to do as it shows up. Having this time to come together, to hear about it from an SE lens, and then to sit together, right? Because I think some of it is about connection. And so our hope today is that we can share this, and then we'll be able to share it with as many people as possible. So thank you again for your willingness to redo this, especially on a day of an eclipse. And we're looking forward to seeing it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm delighted to do it again because it deepens every time. So it's nice. And I'm so thankful to SEI for offering these humanitarian webinars. Truly, as part of our vision that we are actually embodying and living. And so I'm honored to be here to offer this once again on the day of the eclipse. I am on the East Coast, so when we are finished, I think we're not in totality, but I'm going to have partial here, and it's sunny here in where I am. So thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who is listening to this recording, and welcome. Welcome to this webinar on collective grief. I'm going to be looking to my right a little because that's what my notes are. I am honored and humbled to be here with all of you. And, when we offered this webinar live, we had anywhere between 550 and 750 folks who joined us live. And even though I couldn't see everybody or anybody other than you, Rebecca, and some of the organizers, the palpable feeling of creating a community on the spot was undeniable. And I think it speaks to the need for us to come together as a community and to feel into and talk about a topic that I don't know that we talk about it often enough and work with it often enough and honor it often enough. So that's what happened. And it was extremely powerful time. And some people, in fact, commented, the chat that I could see commented that the webinar helped them to feel less alone in their grief. Both personal grief and collective grief, which is today's topic. And to be able to experience it in the body and talk about some ways that we can do that in the body. And how, when we can do that, in an embodied way, grief can not only heal us, but it can mobilize us. It can unite us, even with our uniquenesses, our differences, and especially our disagreements. Grief is a unifier of the human heart and the human nervous system. What I would like to do first is introduce myself to you all, so you know a little bit about who I am. And then we will do a settling together, and then we'll take it from there. My name is Shideh Lennon. I recently relocated from the state of New York, the land of the Esopus, to the state of Maryland, the land of the Piscataway, Kahnoi tribal nation, also known as North Bethesda, is the city in which I live on the East Coast of the United States. I am a clinical psychologist for a long time, a trauma specialist. I am faculty at the Somatic Experiencing International, where I teach both inside the US and outside the US. I'm a child of war. I'm a child of revolution. I was born in Iran And it's so interesting. I've said this story so many times and my heart tightens a little. I just want to share that with you. And that's the shadow of grief there. I lived there until I was 13 years old when there was a very violent revolution and a war that began right after, about a year after the revolution. And so I witnessed a lot. I witnessed violence, death. I felt horror, terror, and confusion at the age of 12 and 13 as a teenager, and a lot of grief subsequently. And, you know, experienced it, still feel keenly the loss of my homeland. And that's a grief that lives in my bones. And I know it lives in the bones of millions of people who have been displaced as well. We left Iran and settled in Europe for a couple of years and then moved to the US when I was about 16 or 17. You know, I often say my Iranian brothers or sisters and sisters were not so lucky to be able to leave. And I also wonder they're together in a way that I don't have the experience of. They're comrades. So it's a mixed experience. You know, grief and collective grief live in the body. They live in the bones, I like to say. You know, in SE, we say to every trauma vortex, to every suffering, there is a counter-vortex. So to every suffering, there's healing. And so for me, that was, and still is, the healing experience of family, of culture, of community, of the tastes, the sounds, the music, really the passions of my culture. And each culture has its own, and also its sense of humor. And through working with my own body, through SE, I've gained access to my grief in a way that I wasn't able to before. I lived a long time in the freeze for many reasons, and grief was one of them. And I've gained access to the power of grief, to its fierceness, really, to its softness, to its life force. And I hope to impart that today to all of you and help each of us to just touch into that a little bit. The body is designed to heal no matter the extent of trauma. That is a hopeful message. That's the message of SE. Even as we witness our world and its many, many griefs, there's a way through together and in the body. When we can share grief, that's a powerful alchemy that happens there. Yeah. So today we'll address that in the short time that we have together. I mean, 2 hours, it is very short. However, the invitation is going to be, and through some of the experiential exercises we'll do, is to touch back into your body, to your ground, the places in you that are feeling all right, even as you allow grief to enter. Yeah. It's a big topic. It's a potential, it's an activating topic, and it's a very healing topic as well. So let us, without any further ado, settle. Let us settle together. And we do this in SE to come back to the body, to come back to what is here. I like to say we do it to come back to our senses. We often take leave of our senses, so to come back to our senses. So find a moment, and you don't have to do this, you know, you don't have to do it, you don't have to be still to come back to center. You can make any movements that your body wants to make. I invite you to look around even. Maybe allowing your eyes to land on something that feels good to look at. And just resting there for a moment. Take a moment to find your feet on the floor. If your feet are on the floor, if they're crossed beneath you, feeling the support of the seat beneath your legs. really feeling the support of the floor and the support of the chair beneath your legs and at your back. Allowing your whole body to receive that support, to rest into that support. You might want to wiggle your toes, notice any tingling or vibrating you might feel there. Feeling the length and the volume of your legs. All the way to your sits bones and your hip bones. Noticing your belly and your lower back. Seeing if you can feel deep into the core. It's a spot between the belly button and the lower back. And if you can't, that's okay. Just notice whatever in your belly you can notice. That's the core, the center of gravity. Feeling your spine all the way from your sacrum, your tailbone, all the way up to your cranium, the base of your skull. The spine that is strong and flexible. Noticing your shoulders all the way down, your arms into your hands. We're just saying hello to what is here. Nothing to change, nothing to fix. Feeling your front body, your chest, and your breath. Feeling your heart, the heart that is the seat of our emotional understanding, our emotional life. Feeling your throat inside your neck, all the way up to your whole head. You might want to move your jaw a little. We tend to keep our jaws pretty tight. Feeling your face, your eyes, your whole head. Saying hello. Maybe even allowing your tongue to relax on the floor of your mouth. Bringing your attention to your front body again. You might, if you feel like it, put a hand on your heart. Saying hello to it. Noticing its mood and its feeling as you take in this moment. Feeling into the large collective field that we are. In the SE community, which is very, 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 very vast. And within the greater collective of our shared humanity. Really feeling into that collective connection. And allowing what you're about to hear and receive to heal you, and allowing it to extend to all beings. When you're ready, if your eyes have been closed, you might open them once again and look around your room once more. If there's a window you can look out of, please do that. It can be very regulating to the nervous system to look outside a little farther away, like at a tree or the sky. When you're ready, you might bring your attention to the general area of the screen once again. Grief is such a huge topic, you know, I always say, where do we begin? Well, we just did. We begin by right here, with welcoming what's here now in the body, in the heart. the other thing I want to mention before I start is that in order to get the most out of this time listening and watching this webinar, I encourage you and invite you to do the exercises that I'm going to take us through. It might feel kind of strange when you're doing it by yourself without a lot of feedback, but if you do them to get a sense in the body, this will be much more useful for you rather than waiting for information to be transmitted. We'll cover what we can with the understanding and awareness that what we can cover is limited, that the topic is vast, that it won't address nor will it resolve everything. I also want to acknowledge the privilege of being here together to talk about grief and feel into its collective nature. We here, when you're listening to this, we are safe enough. Our basic survival needs and life needs have been met enough to be able to spend this time together where a lot of the world is not able to. So I want to invite you to use this privilege well, to use it in service in some way, in the service of healing. And to use it as a source of wisdom. Yeah. Okay. So I know that most of you are either SCPs or have studied SE or know about SE, but you may not have. So I'm going to just give you a very short, I will not do it justice, the explanation or a definition of somatic experiencing so that we have some common ground that we can go from here. Somatic experiencing was developed by Dr. Peter Levine, who is a distinguished expert with 2 doctorates. One is in medical biophysics and the other in psychology. And after years of extensive research and practice, Dr. Levine discovered that traumatic experiences disrupt the natural rhythm of the nervous system. And so what he concluded that healing from trauma is going to need to engage the nervous system and need to reestablish the natural rhythm of the nervous system by engaging the body, which is something that talk therapy misses. So this added dimension of bringing in the nervous system adds depth and actually efficacy to trauma work. SE offers a gentle approach to releasing trauma that's been long held in the body, in the nervous system. It's a bottom-up approach. It's also a top-down approach because the top is also the body. So I always say, it's a holistic approach. A skilled practitioner can assist clients with the right kind of support in becoming aware of their body, including its sensations, its emotions, its thoughts. Yeah. And through this awareness, clients learn ways to regulate their nervous system. As they're supported to do this, then, within the relative safety of the relationship with the practitioner, trauma can unravel and be worked with. Trauma is life energy that's trapped in the body, usually in the form of chronic freeze. That can be accessed, acknowledged, felt, and harnessed. And this process will allow, for a broader and deeper range of expression in real life, not just in the therapy office, a wider range of decisions, of choices where they didn't seem available before. So it's a very realistic kind of healing modality. It helps us function in the world with more choices in the body, yeah. And so, and resilience also. It's a powerful tool for renegotiating trauma. I like to say it literally remembers us. It remembers us. It brings us back to our bodies, to our senses. A big part of trauma is being disconnected. It reconnects us literally, limb to limb. SE is also more than a tool. It's a way of It's a perspective, it's a way of seeing things, a way of making sense of things. Both from a mind perspective, a psychological perspective. I might even, I don't know, you might want to take this out from a spiritual perspective. So, taking a breath, what is collective grief and why is it important to name it? Why do we even want to name it? Collective grief happens when a community, a society, a village, or a nation all experience extreme change or loss. It can manifest in the wake of major events. Of course, some examples include, but are not limited to, war, acts of terrorism, mass shootings, natural disasters, pandemics, and other mass events that result in mass casualties and widespread tragedy. Collective grief involves a loss of life, loss of livelihood. It involves a dramatically changed life circumstances, dramatic change in relationships to self and other, loss of prior functioning, loss of trust in life and in others. It can also lead to a loss of faith in spirituality, in the meanings that we make to make sense of things, to give some order to things. It's a quote from an article called, I'll tell you the name and the author later because I don't have it right in front of me. She says, collective grief occurs when a group of people with shared assumptions experience a common loss. These assumptions are based on the core belief that we are social creatures who are programmed to attach. Think polyvagal theory. That we are individuals that are not separate from family, society, and culture. We are not separate from the context from which we arise and in which we reside. Yeah. We are wired to respond to social cues, which affect our experiences, and we feel pain when we are rejected, shamed, or ostracized by our group. Grief occurs when our shared assumptions, she says, are shattered, resulting in the loss of coherence and meaning. You know, do we need to even name examples, right? I mean, let's look around the world, our own land, our own nation, our own families. You know, each grief is as heartbreaking as the next. Grief's mentioned, grief's televised, grief's put on social media and consumed. For better and for worse. Grief's unmentioned, griefs that live in the shadows, that are not seen, that are ignored, all over the world. Grief, whether it's individual or collective, is the natural reaction to loss. It's a natural reaction. It's our birthright. It is both universal and personal. So individual experiences of grief can vary greatly and are influenced by the nature of the loss. Grief also cannot be separated from its cultural context. We don't have time to go in depth into that. But that's a really important point. Grief is mediated by culture. Culture both creates, influences, shapes, limits, and defines grieving, sometimes profoundly. In some cultures, grief is seen as a weakness. And so it's not actually named. People don't cry because that's a shameful thing. That's a sign of weakness. They just move on. That's a cultural edict. In other cultures, grief is a very individual phenomenon, right? Most cultures, however, are a mixture of community grieving together and individual grief. Grief can accompany any event that disrupts or challenges our sense of normalcy or our sense of our basic who we are. This includes the loss of connections that define us. This is one of the signatures, definitions of grief. It affects the connections that define us. Connection to loved ones, to communities, to the soil, to the land on which we live, to our homeland, our towns, to nature herself. These large-scale events disrupt our attachments, both personally and collectively. Think vagus nerve. Yeah. When there is collective grief, we tend to link and connect with the grief and mourning of others. This collective loss can parallel sometimes our individual process of grief, which is kind of nice. We feel less alone. Yeah. On the other side of it, collective grief can touch for us personal grief. I'll give you a personal example later on. And can get coupled with personal grief, as we say in SE, can get overcoupled when it's traumatic grief with past and individual grief and trauma so that it can trigger it. Collective grief can tap into generational trauma and generational grief as well. There's something we call anticipatory grief. So we're just going into the different flavors of grief and collective grief here. Anticipatory grief is when we know a loss is coming. So our body's preparing and bracing in some ways for the grief to come. So for example, when there's illness in the family, there's a cancer of a loved one or our own, ourselves on a collective level amid disaster, war, famine, we're also anticipating more loss, more destruction, and our bodies begin to prepare for that, brace against that. So there's many, many layers to grief. By the way, we're doing this today on the day of the eclipse, and I was thinking about how, apt it is in some ways, where there's a shadow that's going to cross this, a big shadow, and it's going to, in some parts of the country, block the entire sun, and the temperature drops, right? Some temperatures will drop as much as 10 degrees, even more in that moment. And then the shadow passes and light appears, and made me think of a quote by Sigmund Freud, in fact, who wrote the book Mourning and Melancholia. And the reason, what prompted that book was that he lost his son in the Second World War. He lost the son, so it came out of his own grief. He also was living in the second, he was in Vienna at the time. And so his quote it's a little clinical, but I like it. It says, "The shadow of the object fell upon the ego." What does that mean? It's like a shadow. Grief can feel like a shadow that falls on the heart, right? And so the shadow of the object fell upon the ego. And so the eclipse feels apt. There's grief that we feel even when we don't know the person or persons. So that's vicarious grief that functions in much the same way as grief itself and can be quite challenging because the sense of helplessness can be greater. What to do, we might be helpless to what to do, even greater, when we're witnessing loss from afar. Than when we're in the midst of grief and actually dealing with it day to day, right? In a disaster such as war or a natural disaster, any other mass tragedy, people find connections with each other in that tragedy, and that can be healing. They can help each other, they sustain each other, survive or die together. And if given the opportunity, they will grieve together. So for example, I love this example after a flood, when somebody's lost their home and they're walking down the street, there's somebody at the corner of the street pointing them to the shelter. That simple moment can mitigate grief. Yeah. Getting meals delivered when you've lost a child to a mass shooting. Praying together, coming together. So for us who are relatively privileged, relatively safe in our lives, the challenge is witnessing the world nationally, internationally, and feeling helpless to change it sometimes. And that helplessness can turn into a kind of numbing. It's a perfectly natural reaction to an overwhelming experience about which we feel we can do very little. Or alternatively, when we feel helpless, we can ping into rage. So we find ourselves just raging all the time. And I wonder, does that actually change anything, right? It's a natural reaction. But I wonder if we might want to get curious about what else may be going on inside that we need to get to in those moments. And could it be that there's a component of grief there that we need to feel? Yeah. Why is it important to name grief? Why is it important to name collective grief? Because it's the first step in transforming it. We cannot heal when we don't name it. We cannot heal when we don't face it, and we don't allow our bodies to feel it. We definitely cannot heal. As long as collective grief remains in the shadows of our bodies and our collective relationships, it remains splintered off, it remains dissociated, as we say in SE, it remains undercoupled. Not only that, it can transform into harmful consequences for our bodies and our world. We're going to talk about the neurobiology of grief momentarily, and we'll talk about how that can happen. Let's talk about what we know of the neurobiology of grief. This is the author I was mentioning before. Joanna Chambers is her name. She's an associate professor of psychiatry and OBGYN at the Indiana University School of Medicine. This article was published in 2023 in Psychodynamic Psychiatry, and grief as a requisite for change. We need grief for real transformation to happen. She says, in acute grief, there's a loss of emotional and neurovegetative regulation. We would say it's basically a loss of nervous system regulation. Feelings of sadness, anger, anxiety, emotional numbing, and poor concentration, as well as a dysregulated rhythm of sleep and appetite. Biomarkers such as heart rate, think vagus nerve. The vagus nerve helps to regulate our heart rate variability, blood pressure, von Willebrand factor, which is I believe it has to do with blood clotting, but don't quote me on that. Platelet and granulocyte aggregates. These are all blood functions. Cortisol levels, of course, and hypothalamic pituitary axis regulation all become disrupted during acute bereavement. Yeah. In addition, listen to this, because I'm going to elaborate on this. The inflammatory system is affected in bereaved adults, where interleukin-6 and interleukin-1 become elevated with lymphocyte proliferation. Lymphocytes are white blood cells that fight infection, and antibody responses are lower. The effects of these changes are significant and may lead to increased morbidity and mortality in the bereaved, if the grief is not dealt with, I would add. So let us unpack that from an SE perspective. Yeah. Grief disrupts, as does any stressor, any other stressor, the natural rhythm of our autonomic nervous system, the natural pendulation from sympathetic to parasympathetic back again, among other things. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for so many survival functions and is responsible for our stress response, for our fight and flight response, for our freeze response, and for our collapse response as well. But I want to focus on the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is a main protagonist here. And it's like a hero in my mind. So let's get nerdy a little bit, because this is just it speaks to the beauty and the intricate brilliance of the nervous system. Right? It's just amazing. So anyway, the HPA axis is a highway between some structures in the brain, specifically the hypothalamus and our adrenal glands, for one. So the hypothalamus, the middle of the brain, part of the limbic, all the way into our adrenal glands, which are sitting where? Right on top of the kidneys. So it is the highway for our stress response system and involves also our hormonal, our endocrine system, our hormones and neurotransmitters. One of the hormones is called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. Now, this hormone will stimulate the release of another hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that will then trigger the adrenal glands to release what? Cortisol. Right? I mean, just incredible. However, the CRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone, has also a role in our inflammatory response. And many chronic illnesses, which we're finding more and more, are one of the contributors to it is an inflammatory, chronic inflammatory response, right? Many chronic illnesses. So when grief hasn't been processed in the body, guess what? It can, as with any other unprocessed stressful experience, turn into inflammatory processes and chronic illness. And this is, in this article, which is based on research, she only is talking about acute grief. And when we talk about chronic grief, chronic collective grief, or individual grief, when the grief, loss, fear keep coming, the nervous system becomes overwhelmed and goes into a kind of a chronic freeze and shutdown state, into numbing, in order to ensure survival. This is very wise on the part of the nervous system to go into shutdown and freeze, except that the freeze response is meant to be temporary. In the wild, animals experience a kind of a jolt, a shock. They collapse, they freeze, danger passes. They take a breath within seconds, right? Come back to, they shake it off and they hop away. So the freeze response is very, very effective, and it's meant to be temporary. Now, when it becomes chronic is when we run into chronic syndromes, chronic illnesses, pain syndromes, all of that. So this is very wise on the part of the nervous system, I said. However, also, in collective grief, as I said, one of the things that get disrupted is connections. So when the communal support system falls apart or is not available, when the very fabric of what keeps people together and connected is the very thing that's being lost through tragedy, whether it's a natural disaster or a war or an act of terrorism, pandemic, then freeze is very wise. It's costly, but the nervous system feels it's the only thing it can do to ensure survival. And chronic, we don't have time to talk about epigenetics, but certainly intergenerational trauma is the handing down of these chronic survival strategy responses from generation to generation. Yeah. Disenfranchised grief is grief that's not able to be processed. So in shamanism, we call it soul loss. The grief of trauma is so intense that the body disconnects from an essential part of itself, from its life force. In SE, we might call it numbing or dissociation. I like soul loss. Soul loss. This is grief which comes from a loss that is not acknowledged or given public recognition. In this, certainly in the world, in the US as well, we have a lot of disenfranchised grief following the pandemic, where people were not allowed to see their loved ones before they died or properly bury or grieve their loved ones. because of COVID restrictions. To gather, we weren't allowed to gather to grieve, which then created accumulated suffering and pain. Or those disenfranchised grief may be people who lose loved ones to a natural disaster and the body's not found. Yeah, there's no body to be mourned. Don't lose heart, because in the second half, we're going to talk about how we work with this. How do we work with this? Grief can also happen in us, even if we don't personally know the people involved, as I mentioned. We call that parasocial grief. Parasocial grief is, the most obvious example of it is when a celebrity dies and it feels like our nearest and dearest has died, because that public figure for us symbolized something very, very important and meaningful. We grieve the loss of what they represented to us, and we grieve it together. I'll share a personal example with you. When we left Iran, my father, who was my parents had been divorced for a long time. He had remarried, had another family, and so he stayed behind. And I never saw him again. So we left in 1979. I never saw him again, and very little contact. And in 2008, I got a call from my mother, who had heard that my father had died. And she said, "I'm so sorry." She was a little tearful. And I was like, "Okay, cool. Thanks, Mom." Nothing. I did not shed one tear. It seemingly didn't mean much to me. I went about my life until 2016, when one of the people that I've always admired for his poetry is Leonard Cohen. It's sort of like he is the bard of my heart. It's just his lyrics are just so powerful. So I'd been following Leonard Cohen and really learning about his life, reading anything I could get my hands on him and his work. And even saw him live in concert, which was a night of my life. It was amazing. Anyway, in November of 2016, which was also a very significant time politically in this country, it was an election. A few days before the election, I heard that he had died. And so I remember I came home that day. This was 2 days after the election that I heard he had died. And I remember putting my work stuff on the floor of my bedroom and just literally my body crumpling to the floor and wailing. Now, as I look back at that, what was I wailing for? Really, what was the grief? The parasocial grief was for the man, Leonard Cohen, and what he represented to me. Was I also grieving my father? I am certain. But it was through that channel. Was I grieving the loss of bigger losses? Was I grieving the loss of my land? Was I grieving what was happening in this country? Very likely. So parasocial grief, when we are in touch with it, we can feel it can open up, as I said, personal griefs and individual, and we can work through it through parasocial grief. And, that moment was very, very, in some ways, very freeing for my body. It lifted a weight off of my heart. The other piece about earlier, I was talking about vicarious grief. The vicarious grief that impacts us through climate change, through the grief of natural disasters that are not in my backyard, but are in Maui and Texas and Afghanistan. The grief of wars that are in Africa and Gaza and Ukraine. Guilt can be a big part of vicarious grief. And shame. Helplessness. When we witness but are not directly involved, these reactions physiologically can be ones of numbing out, feeling paralyzed, avoidant. That's the freeze response. On the other hand, out of helplessness, we might overexpose ourselves to images of disaster, of war. It's almost like something in us tells us, if I look at this enough, that I'm doing something about it. In some ways, that can help us activate, right, and mobilize to do something. However, if these images lead to more numbness, that's a sign that we are overwhelmed, that we need to feel our grief first, yeah? So let's take a moment. I've done a lot of talking already. Let's take a moment to come back to your seat, to your body. Take a breath. You might want to move a little. You might want to feel your feet on the floor and your back of the chair. Notice what's here now. After taking in my words so far, you might put a hand on your heart if that's helpful, or one on the belly. And just noticing what is here. Is there a sensation inside? Is there warmth or cold? Is there numbness or tightness? Taking a moment with that. Maybe noticing a feeling that may be there. Taking some time with this feeling. Whatever the feeling is, it's welcome, whether it's sadness or overwhelm or irritation or boredom. Notice it, say hello to it. Being curious about what is here. If you have your hand on your heart or your belly, this is not to make the feelings go away. It's just to let them know that you're offering support. Letting whatever experience is there know that you really feel it there, that it's there for a reason. And just being with that. Finding a place inside of you, if you can, that's feeling all right, warm, supported. Resting there for a moment. And allowing that all right place to hold and support any areas of discomfort. Yeah. One of the main, I would say the main tool that we use in somatic experiencing is time and space. Why? It is slowing down. Why? Because one of the definitions of trauma is too much, too fast, too soon. The nervous system did not have any chance to react, to orient, to organize itself, to react, to fight or flee. And its capacity to cope was overwhelmed by the speed of events. So time and space is the foundational counter-vortex to the trauma vortex of too much, too fast, too soon. Now, another definition of trauma is too little, too late, too slow. Help didn't come, support never came. It was too late by the time they arrived. It was too late. That's another definition of trauma. That also benefits from time and space. I like the phrase sacred pause for time and space. It's a phrase that they use in meditative practices, spiritual traditions. To me, that sacred pause evokes, what does it evoke? It evokes compassion. It evokes the necessity of pausing. It evokes its connection to the collective. It's not about religion, but it's about sacred because it's human. It's in the body. It's our birthright to pause and to take time to feel into something And it invokes the body's wisdom when we allow a pause. So slowing down again and again, coming back to the body, its sensations, its emotion with curiosity and kindness. When we were doing the exercise, I said, putting your hand on your heart, not to make the discomfort go away. That's exactly right. This is not about making discomfort go away, but making room for it, increasing our capacity for it. When we do that, the grief not only becomes lighter or whatever the experience is, or softer or fuller, but it can also transform into an impulse to act in a way that is more rooted in the wisdom of our body rather than reactive mobilization versus a mobilization that's born of that sacred pause and really being with what is there first before acting, being led by the body. Increasing our capacity to feel grief in the body is one way out of collapse and helplessness, and a way into mobilizing for right action. I have heard people say, well, if I give in to my grief, it's just going to drown me. I'm so afraid it's going to take over. When, with the right support and time and space, and finding resources within and without the body. But what is a resource is the places in you that feel all right. That's a resource. It's something nice to look at, something pleasant to look at around you. That's a resource. Is the thought of a loved one that has always been supportive. That's a resource. With resource in and outside the body, then we can feel into grief in a way that won't overwhelm us. This is the point of SE. To support increasing our capacity for discomfort. Why do we want to do that? Because discomfort is inevitable, because grief is inevitable, right? SE is not about being copacetic and regulating and being relaxed. It is not about relaxation. It's about responsiveness. Sometimes that responsiveness is anger, rage. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it's wailing in grief. Now, our bodies, as I said, when I'm afraid grief is going to swallow me up if I feel it, our bodies and minds have defenses against difficult emotions on an individual level and on a collective level. Yeah. So in the body, these defenses can show up as what? As constrictions in different parts of the body, in different parts of the physiology, like a tightness in the chest. Usually is a constriction, is a way that or the throat or the heart, is a way that the body has of tightening against emotion, against, let's say, grief. That's what we're talking about, tightening of the jaw or shoulders, tightening of the diaphragm. These constrictions are meant to protect us. Or, as I've said and will repeat, numbness and disconnect are another way that the body has of protecting itself from emotion. Psychologically as well, we have mechanisms against feelings that we believe are intolerable. These come in the form of denial, dismissal, grief is weak, minimizing, judging, or if I let myself feel grief, I will never be able to mobilize towards action. I'll just be a helpless lump. So we confuse helplessness with feeling grief. They're different. They're actually opposite. So just a few minutes ago, we did a short exercise on just checking with the body and pausing. So let's do another one. Let's pause once again to come into the body again. Coming into the support of the seat and of the floor. Softening your gaze, softening your tongue. Coming into what feels okay inside. And if there's nothing inside that feels okay, Feeling the support of the seat at your back. Or listening to a sound that feels good to listen to. There's always, always support around us. Take a moment now to recall a time of grief in your life. The loss of a loved one, perhaps of a pet. Some loss. Take a moment with that and notice what happens inside as you bring that loss to mind. What are the sensations inside? Is there tightness? Is there warmth? Cold? Is there a fullness or an emptiness, perhaps? Really saying hello to any sensation that is there, even if it's numbness or nothing. That's also something. Maybe being curious about any emotions that may be there around this loss. And if so, where do you feel that emotion? In the heart, maybe in the belly. Sometimes we feel emotions behind the eyes. Again, if there is no emotion, if it's numbness, just say hello to that. Let it know you see it there. Let it know it too has a place. Now let's take a moment. I'm going to invite all of us to stand up. And you can also do seated, so don't feel like you have to stand if you would rather, or if you need to stay seated. This exercise is easily done in a seated position. And again, if you have any restrictions in movement, feel free to adjust for that and take care of yourself. You might, if you're standing, want to hold on to the back of a chair, edge of a table. And we're going to start with our left ankle. And just turn your ankle around in any way that feels good. There is no rule to this other than feeling good. Now beginning to move your left knee. Bending it, straightening it. We're working with the joints. Joints hold trauma. Joints hold tension and constriction. Just moving the knee and allowing the hip to join the party. Moving the left hip. Notice your breath. And placing your left foot back on the floor, and take a moment to feel into the left leg and the right leg. And notice if you sense any difference between the two. You may or may not. Taking the right ankle now. And again, gently moving it. Might want to notice where your knee now, right knee rather. Notice where you have an exhale. That's a sign of pendulation back into parasympathetic. And right hip. Wonderful. And putting your right foot back on the floor and just noticing your whole lower body. Starting with the right wrist. And right elbow. I am noticing a lightening in my heart area today. And shoulder. And letting your right arm flop to your side and feeling the right, feeling the left. Seeing if you can sense any difference or shifts between the two. Left wrist. Left elbow. Left shoulder. And letting your left arm rest by your side and feeling both arms. Taking your neck and moving it from only if this feels okay. If it doesn't, do not do it. And taking your eyes, I'm not going to do this because my eyes don't like this, but if you would like, you can look up and then look down and to the sides with your eyes. Just activating some of the social engagement nerves in the face. I might want to move your jaw. In fact, you can even make faces and sounds. We're bringing in the vagus nerve to the party here. And all of the other social engagement nerves. Take a moment to swallow. Cough. And last but not least, seeing if your ears can pick up the farthest sound that they can pick up. Again, the vagus nerve does not go to the face, but it does go to the inner ear, the throat, and the rest of the body. When you're ready, you might take a seat once again. And now with the same curiosity, touching back into the loss that you brought to mind earlier. And noticing what you notice now. Sensations, emotions, thoughts or impulses. Is there a shift from before or not? I'll share with you my experience today, which is just a general, definitely looser joints, but as I did that, I have more access to sadness when I didn't before. So this is what happens. This is another important SE tool so time and space pausing, not trying to change it or make it go away. Number two, movement. Self-touch is another one. We did the heart and the belly. Another important SE tool is movement. When we are faced with overwhelming experiences, moving the body, gentle movement. Sometimes vigorous movement is called for, but generally not. In this case, we move the joints because, as I said, the joints hold shock, they hold constriction, they hold places where the body holds back emotion and grief. So when we move the joints, we help ease our access to those experiences, to those feelings, whether it's emotion like grief or other experiences. One of the reasons experiences feel intolerable is not because they are, is because our bodies have constricted against them for so long, for good reason, that it feels like they're going to overwhelm us. It's the constriction that actually creates there's a train going by. It's the constriction in the joints, in the musculature that actually enhances the suffering. And what SC does is gently unravel the constrictions through and offers support so that these experiences like grief can be felt and not be as overwhelming. Yeah. You know, we cannot cure grief. We don't want to regulate grief away, but we can help to transmute it out of constriction or helplessness into life force by supporting the body to experience it fully. This bears repeating. Through the sacred pause, through self-touch, through movement, and then checking back in to see where the grief is, how it's shifted. I like to call that the alchemy of grief. When we do that together, imagine the power of that. The collective healing power of that will touch everything else we do and feel. I want to read you a poem which I came across by Cameron Awkward-Rich. Cameron is a scholar. Cameron is a trance scholar who teaches at, oh gosh, I forget now. I want to say Howard University, but I may be wrong. His name is Cameron Awkward-Rich, and this poem is called Meditations in an Emergency. I wake up and it breaks my heart. I draw the blinds and the thrill of rain breaks my heart. I go outside, I ride the train, walk among the buildings, men in Monday suits, the flight of doves, the city of tents beneath the underpass, the huddled mass, old women hawking roses and children, all of them break my heart. There's a dream I have in which I love the world. I run from end to end like fingers through her hair. There are no borders, only wind. Like you, I was born. Like you, I was raised in the institution of dreaming. Hand on my heart. Hand on my stupid heart. We must let the world break our heart and feel it. That to me is the ultimate act of compassion. Not to be overwhelmed or hopeless, but to feel it fully and be moved to act out of that wisdom. That's the gift of SC, that's the gift of embodiment. Where do we feel grief in the body? Where do you feel grief in the body? Is it in the heart? Is it in the belly? Is it in the head, behind the eyes? There's no right answer. Is it all through the body, like a whole body felt sense? Take a moment to be curious about where you feel grief in your body. Eugene Genlin, who is the developer of the focusing technique, has a beautiful quote that says, "A felt sense is not a mental experience, but a physical one. A bodily awareness of a situation or person or event. An internal aura that encompasses everything you feel and know about a given subject at a given time, encompasses it and communicates it to you all at once rather than detail by detail." Is grief a whole body felt sense when we allow it? Can we allow it to be that? What does unworked through grief that hasn't been worked through collectively look like in a society? Just like in an individual, it might lead to helplessness, collapse, or rage. So can it in a society, in a whole culture. Collectively, it can look like despair, societal numbness, increased risk of chronic illness and heart disease as a collective, substance abuse, death, as I mentioned above. Unacknowledged and unnamed collective grief, or grief that is not allowed to be processed as a society or culture, that can turn into polarization, can turn into rage and violence, both ideological and in action. This is another quote from the research article I mentioned before. When a group is traumatized by others, such as they cannot mourn adaptively, the trauma gets processed in other ways. Group trauma is often passed down to the next generation through unconscious, emotional, and physical gestures. I would also add through epigenetics, which is the ways genes can or cannot express, leaving the children to complete the mourning process. Group trauma may also lead to the building of monuments to reflect the pain of the trauma. These monuments contain the conflict of the traumatized group, allowing the group to continue mourning their and their ancestors' losses while simultaneously attempting to complete the mourning process. Hence, the monument becomes a shared linking object, or an object that connects them and enables their disallowed mourning to continue. The monument becomes a storage place for the pain caused by the trauma, which cannot be expressed elsewhere. So instead of being able to openly express grief, the hope and wish to recover what was lost may lead to feelings of rage and revenge. This is the legacy of grief that gets handed down from generation to generation when unprocessed and unnamed, and it turns into, as I said, epigenetics over time. When collective grief is named and felt, when it can take up the space that it needs, it can be transmuted into connection and action. Examples of this include, but are not limited to, several weeks ago, we witnessed the funeral of Alexei Navalny in Russia, where thousands of people showed up at great risk to their lives in an outpouring of grief that also, in its very gentle and heartfelt mobilization, became a de facto protest. That was a manifestation of the power of collective grief. People in tears carrying flowers. They were carrying like carnations. Gentle and powerful. Here's a quote by Washington Irving. "There's a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love." The Black Lives Matter movement was born out of the collective horror and grief of the killing of George Floyd, one of many, that led to the largest protest movement in the history of the United States, the largest, larger than the civil rights movement. Open grieving is bound up with outrage. And outrage in the face of injustice or unbearable loss has an enormous potential to transform. The George Floyd protests lived up to that. Collective grief, when named and felt in the body, is transmuted into collective action. That collective action is one of the counter-vortices to the trauma of collective grief, both because it mobilizes the nervous system out of numbness and helplessness, but because it is collective. It creates a bond of connection between people, the very thing that is lost during a mass traumatic event. Here's a question that I grapple with, and I think we all should grapple with it, and because there's no easy answers. How might we understand grief when the event has yet to end? When the injuries not only endure, but are inflicted anew? Can one grieve what hasn't yet stopped happening? You know, we might say in SC that we might find moments, what Peter Levine calls islands of safety, even in the midst of ongoing loss. One moment of eye contact with another, one moment of feeling the feet on the floor, on the ground. But it's a large question. It's a good question. Let's acknowledge how big this question is. Not to make it overwhelm us, but to witness it. Can we be with that big question? If it helps you, you might put a hand on your heart or on your belly or both and acknowledge, yeah, this is big. Feeling your feet on the floor, if it feels very too big, you might even push your feet into the floor a little bit so that you activate your quadricep muscles. So allow your lower body, the strong lower body, to the extent that you can, support this big question. Notice your breath as you do this. Notice how your whole body can be with that bigness. And together. One of the big contributions in the field of trauma, as you all know, has been the polyvagal theory of Stephen Porges. And Deb Dana, an expert on the theory and applications of this theory, calls this polyvagal theory the science of safety, the science of safe connections. At its best, the naming of collective grief for what it is, feeling it in the body together rather than reactively avoiding it, numbing to it or acting it out, that very collective action will create social engagement, which is the best of our vagus nerve, polyvagal theory. Social engagement is what goes offline in trauma, what gets lost. And regaining access to it with others who are relatively safe is one of the goals of our work as we work with grief. Here's a quote by Stephen Jenkinson, who's a grief expert. It's from his book called Reckoning. He says, seeing things your way is not that big an achievement, but being willing to be heartbroken together while not being in agreement, that's for real. That really counts. That's how you can tell you're in the presence of a couple of grown-ups. Seeing things your way is not that big an achievement, but being willing to be heartbroken together while not being in agreement is quite an achievement. Grief can bind us even when we disagree. So to summarize what I've talked about today is we need to name collective grief for what it is. We looked at the physiology of grief. We looked at what happens in the body when grief is not processed. We also looked at how unprocessed collective grief can lead to collective numbness, violence, avoidance, and polarization. We then need to address grief in the body through these tools, time and space, the sacred pause. Support through self-touch and movement. Finding the sensations and emotions in the body and supporting them through self-touch and movement. When we practice that, we become more available to wise choices in our actions. We also took a brief look at how impactful the expression of collective grief can be in a society. Any questions?
So this one keeps kind of coming over and over again through these different experiences, through the conversation. And I think you touched on it with that quote right there, with the achievement is being able to share the grief. And so I guess the question then is, you know, not only as an SE community, but as a world, we're gonna disagree, and different grief is gonna happen, and all of it's real. And what space does SE, what space does holding our own grief and collective grief give us for being able to be in those moments of hearing someone else's grief, even if it's they butt heads with each other? I guess I don't
Our
know how to
grief
say that differently.
absolutely, absolutely. That's the love, and it's so true. And in some way, you know, our challenge, and we are charged with as people who are SE informed, to, in some way, in that moment of grief's butting heads, it's no longer, from an SE perspective, the way that I think about it, it's no longer, it comes down to me in that moment. It comes down to me feeling the friction of the griefs that don't mesh in my body. It comes back to me regulating that in myself. It comes, you know, so it comes back to me finding my body in that, finding my feet on the floor in that, putting a hand on my heart, not because I agree with the other person's grief necessarily, but because I'm feeling my own activation in that, right? So Tara Brach, who's a meditation teacher, talks about it as the making the U-turn. And really, SC is about making the U-turn into our own body in the moment, right? And looking at how we are being pinged in that moment with this other person or people who are grieving, but in a very different, diametrically opposed kind of ways. And so my first responsibility in that moment is to come back to this and to work with myself, with my own dysregulation. You know, I think with time, I know for myself, and taking the space to do that, right? Not going back into the fire, but taking the space to actually regulate, to get support, to be with a community who shares my grief, let's say. And from that place, then touching into that friction a little bit. In SC, we call it titrating. You know, bringing that to mind, maybe not with that person, but in my own mind. What does that take? That takes the willingness to do that. Right? That takes the willingness to not just feel my own discomfort, but then to be curious about, all right, I'm in a better place now. I feel my feet. I have support around my grief. Let me just get curious about this other person's grief. Is their body any different than mine? Is their HPA axis any different than mine? Right. You know, is there heart, you know, is their vagus nerve different than mine? You know, so it's sort of like ideally helps us to level that playing field of, oh, on the surface, it's very different. Physiologically, it's not. So I don't know if that answers it, or you want more clarification, or whether we want to cut this answer out completely altogether.
No, I think it's vital in a world where there's so much pain, and
Yeah.
humans cause pain to each other at times, and we all want our pain to be seen and validated, and our grief to have a space. And I think that exactly is, for me, it's really helpful to hear how other people navigate that. Um, so thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, absolutely. You know, we need, and this is a privilege too.
Mhm.
Actually, it's a birthright, but not everybody has that access to it. A support system where we have enough safety, where we can feel, so that then we can offer ourselves up to people we disagree with in a more regulated way, right? So, but that's a dilemma. Most of the world, most of us sometimes don't have that support. And so our first task is to, you know, even as SC practitioners, to help somebody who comes into my office to feel that support with me, you know, and so people say, well, I don't have enough support, or my community has been decimated. Where do I get the support, right? And that's hard. That's hard. I mean, this is sort of, you know, in some way, SE, you know, in some way we need, and we need more collective healers. We need more people like yourself, like me, like all of this beautiful community of SE practitioners to go and support the communities who don't have that, because otherwise the disagreement is gonna just grind on itself. You know, we get reactive in disagreement. We want to jump back and we want to push back. And one of the beauties of SC is the sacred pause. It's like, oh, what would it be like if I didn't? What would it be like if I took a step in, not even back, but a step into myself? It's not a small feat. You know, I wish I had a better answer. This is what I got today.
No, I think it's the best answer, because it's not easy. I think that quote is so perfect as a sort of a catalyst to holding all that you've been talking about today in a way that says it takes work, right? But that work is the ability to sit with the discomfort. I think you said it so perfectly, that putting a hand on the heart isn't about making the grief go away. It's about giving it space. Like you, when I
Exactly.
moved my joints, there was more space for sadness. Before that, there was numbness. And then there's more space for the work to happen. Is it
Yes.
easy? No. And it's doable because we have the support. Um, so I think it's perfect what you've said.
And, you know, over time, the sadness itself, grief itself becomes the support,
Right.
becomes the resource. You know, it's no longer something, um, you know, with a lot of work, of course, not easy. It's no longer something to get away from, but it's actually life force. It's resource.
Yeah.
Resource doesn't have, you know, resource is not just a pleasant pink flower, right? At its best, is the feeling that was once intolerable and now I can be with it.
Yeah. It's exactly what you
You
said
know,
at the very beginning, that what SE is, trauma is stuck energy, and releasing
yeah,
that is life force. So
yeah,
in this moment, that sadness becomes life force. It's something different from the freeze. So
And I
absolutely,
would argue that sadness becomes kindness and compassion.
absolutely.
And I have a poem I want to read on kindness in a way that, because kindness is its own form of activism.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right? I think quite powerful form of activism that I'm not sure we're ready for in our adolescence in this world.
Moment by moment.
Exactly, one moment at a time. Yeah, let me read it. Can I read it? Yeah, great. This poem I read also in the live webinar. It's called Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. It's in her book called Words Under the Words. And she says, before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it until your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. When we can touch into our grief in the body at its depth, the only outcome is kindness. It's the only thing that can come out of it. Why doesn't it? Because I think we are conditioned to react and we're conditioned to not feel grief and sadness and the vulnerability of that. It's a lot less vulnerable to feel anger than it is to feel grief. On the face of it, anyway. You know? So closing, thank you so much. This just deepens every time. And I'm so grateful to have offered this again. And I hope that you who listen to this, who watch this, will take it with you. That it's useful to you, that it will help you to offer yourself to grief and offer yourself to others in this way. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for redoing this. I know it's
Sure.
not easy, but also the ability, and I agree. I was there last time too, and it deepens it, and somehow at the beginning it's interesting. I felt the two of us, or the three of us with Caroline, and as we sat here, I felt the collective grow, right? The ability to
Beautiful.
bring in all the people that were here last time and all who continue to watch it. Over time, it's like I could feel all of us together in this space. So thank you. Thank you for helping us
Yes.
all sit with that, with each other, knowing that as you said, it gets us deeper and deeper into the ability to show up in the world with kindness.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you and SEI for doing such good work. Truly, truly.